Welcome to the channel. This is Winters and this is my review of Death from the Skies. I'm going to try and keep this review as quick and as concise as possible. So first we're going to start off with an overview. What is Death from the Skies? What is it all about? Then we're going to talk about flyer wings and using flyers in 40k. Then we're going to have a look at some of the rules changes and lastly look at the dogfight phase. First up, what is Death from the Skies? What is it all about? Well, welcome to Warhammer 40k 8th edition. If you're playing with flyers in Warhammer 40k, the rules for flyers have changed, and the rules in this book overrule the rule in the main Warhammer 40k rulebook. But this is your game. When Warhammer 40k 7th edition came out, you could choose to ignore this edition and continue to play with 6th edition if you wanted to. Now Death from the Skies has come out. If you play with a small group of friends, you could choose to ignore this if you want to and continue to play with just this book. But if you want to play with the most up-to-date Warhammer 40k rules, then you need both of these books. Death from the Skies affects flyers only, not fly monstrous creatures. How flyers changed? Well, they move differently on the battlefield now. They're more mobile. They shoot differently. The rules for shooting with flyers and trying to hit flyers has changed. And they position themselves differently on the battlefield. We now have the introduction of wings, and also they can interact with each other when they're off the battlefield with the new dogfight phase. The book itself is broken into 3 parts. There's a chunk of fluff, this bit and this bit is a chunk of rules, and the majority of the book is consists of the new data sheets. The flyer data sheets in this book overrule the flyer data sheets that are currently listed in the codexes, in the relevant codexes. So for example, Space Marines has a Storm Wing in their codex. The rules for this Storm Wing overrule the Storm Wing in the main Space Marine book. So that's the general overview. This book is Warhammer 40k 8th edition. You need both of these books to play the game with the most up-to-date rules if you use flyers. It's not an add-on, it's not a supplement like Cities of Death or Planet Strike. Now let's dive into it and look at flyers and using flyer wings in games of 40k. You can choose to bring along flyers as different units and they'll take up 2 slots just as they did before, or you can bring along a flyer wing. A flyer wing is 2 to 4 flyers of the same model type. They don't have to have the same loadout, so 2 Storm Talons can form 1 flying wing, 2 Helldrakes, 2 Crimson Hunters. They'll all form 1 flyer wing. Flyer wings take up 1 slot, and when they come on the table, you roll for reserves as normal and you roll for them as 1 unit, and when they appear they must be deployed within 4 inches of each other. Flyers in flyer wings operate independently of each other and they can fly off and target different targets and do whatever you want them to do. And there is a second type of flyer wing. If you don't want to bring models of the same type, you can bring along formations such as this new strike wing. The Black Heart Talon formation will form a strike wing, Orc Squadron, Custom Waz Mob. These are all types of strike wings, so when they appear on the battlefield, they must be within 4 inches of each other. Then they can fly off all over the place. If you bring along a flying wing, 1 flyer can be upgraded to be a wing leader for free at no additional points cost. So you select a model, you roll a dice at the beginning, a d3 at the beginning of the game, and depending on what you get, confers that benefit to that model. Flyers in strike wings can choose to form attack patterns. Depending on what attack pattern you've got, depends on what bonuses are conferred to the flyer. We're not going to review all the bonuses for the attack patterns here, but needless to say, the more flyers that you have in an attack pattern, the more benefits that you have, or the more devastating the attack pattern can be. The fewer flyers, the less benefits, the less bonuses that you get. There's also a new detachment, an air superiority detachment, which consists of 1 to 3 strike wings, and you get benefits if you bring along the air superiority detachment. So a flyer wing is 2 to 4 models of the same type or a formation. Now let's go and have a look at the flyer rules. First up, flyers now have a combat role. They're either attack flyers, bombers or fighters. The combat role affects them during the dogfight phase, which we'll get to later. It also affects them if they are in an attack pattern. So for example, in this attack pattern here, depending on whether the flyer is an attack flyer, bomber or fighter, depends on which one you use. 3 fighters here, they use this benefit. Here's another attack pattern. Let's say they're 3 Sunshock bombers, then you use this benefits during this attack pattern. Also now, only fighters can use Skyfire mode versus other flyers. Bombers and attack flyers will snap fire at other flyers. So the new Stormhawk Interceptor is a fighter, and when it is on the table, not during dogfights, when it's on the table and it chooses to fire at a Storm Talon gunship in zooming mode, it can choose Skyfire mode and hit it at full ballistic skill. When a Storm Talon gunship, which is an attack flyer, chooses to shoot back at the Stormhawk Interceptor, it can only snap fire. Same as Storm Raven gunships. If you have two Storm Raven gunships on the table in zooming mode, they will be snap firing at each other and not firing at each other at full ballistic skill. But when fighters such as the Dakka Jet or the Crimson Hunter fire at ground targets, they fire at ground targets with -1 ballistic skill. So the Dakka Jet will be hitting on 6s, for example, on all ground targets. It tells you what air and ground targets are. So air targets are your skimmers, your jet bikes, your flying monstrous creatures, flying gargantuan creatures, things like that. Fighters can fire at them at full ballistic skill. Can fire at your fighter, can come on and fire at your wave serpent and your jet bikes and hit them at full ballistic skill. But anything entirely on the ground is -1 ballistic skill. It's interesting. They don't clear up the flying monstrous creatures rule. When a flying monstrous creature is on the table and just using its feet rather than its wings, it still counts as a flying monstrous creature, so you'll still be hitting it at full ballistic skill, even if it's running along the tabletop. As well as the combat roll, flyers have also been given a pursuit and agility stat, which affect them in the dogfight phase and how they function on the tabletop. So when a flyer is on the tabletop and it goes flat out, typically it moves 12 to 24 inches. Now you add the pursuit stat to that distance. So a Storm Wolf will go 16 to 28 inches when it goes flat out. And when they're on the tabletop, they can also choose to do something called a break turn, which is a Diet Coke version of Vector Dancer. You make an agility roll equal or less than your agility score, and you can do an extra turn during the movement phase. Here's your flyer. At the start of the movement phase, you can pivot up to 90 degrees, and then you start moving. Then you make an agility roll, and if you pass the break test, you can pivot again another 90 degrees partway through your movement phase. So interestingly, beforehand, if there was anything behind you, it was very, very hard to hit it. This thing could pivot, could move a tiny little fraction, and then make a break test, and if it passes 3 or less, it can turn again and then shoot at stuff behind it. For models like the Crimson Hunter, they've still got Vector Dancer. And they've also got the highest agility in the game because, you know, Eldar need help. So this vehicle can essentially make 3 90-degree pivots a turn. It can pivot at the start, it can make a break test, which it will only fail on the 6, pivot again, and then at the end of the movement phase make a Vector Dancer and pivot again. But if a flyer suffers a crew stun result, its pursuit and agility value drops to 0. So that's how the model's combat roll, pursuit and agility affects how it functions on the tabletop. The rules are only 2 pages long, and there's a couple of other points in here. Flyers can no longer receive cover from intervening models or terrain. Flyers with the hover type can choose to enter in hover mode rather than flying. And then we have the air superiority rule, which is very poorly worded. Essentially, flyers, if any flyers are in reserve at the end of the dogfight phase, they get plus or minuses to their reserve rolls, and the enemies have minuses to their reserve rolls. So if one player has brought along some flyers and the other player hasn't got any flyers, does that mean they have air superiority and affect reserve results? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say no. The dogfight phase takes place at the start of each game turn between flyers that are in reserve. If only one player has flyers in reserve and neither player does, then a dogfight does not take place. So if you've got a couple of flyers and your opponent hasn't got any flyers, then the dogfight doesn't take place. I'm assuming they mean the dogfight phase doesn't take place, and therefore air superiority rule doesn't count. But if both of you have flyers in reserve, for example at turn 1 when flyers are off the table, then you can choose to have a dogfight with each other. If both of you don't want to dogfight, you don't have to dogfight. This flyer goes in that direction, that flyer goes in that direction. You don't have to dogfight each other. But interestingly enough, if one person wants to have a dogfight, then you roll off, and the winner of that roll can choose whether or not they want a dogfight. So you might not even want to have a scrap, but your opponent does, chucks a dice roll at it, and all of a sudden you're having a dogfight. The most important thing to note about the dogfight phase is a flyer can be destroyed and can be shot down before it ever reaches the table. So previously in 7th edition, if you bought a flyer and your opponent bought a flyer, they were guaranteed to hit the table at some point as soon as you made your reserve rolls. Now you could dogfight in turn 1 when they're off the table and blow your enemy flyer up so it never gets to the battlefield. How does the dogfight phase work? Well, you roll a dice to find out who is the attacker and who is the defender, and there's a modifier to the dice roll depending on the number of bombers in reserve. The winner of the roll-off, the attacker, then picks one of their models and picks one of the opponent's models they wish to dogfight with, and put those two models 36 inches apart, somewhere that's not on the battlefield. Typically the attacker will pick a fighter and choose to go up against a bomber or an attack fighter because fighters have certain benefits in dogfights. Then there's an engagement sub-phase. There's just as many chances for the attacker and defender to win, but the winner of that phase can either choose to close the distance or increase the distance, or if their pursuit value is high enough, break away and disengage entirely. Then there is a maneuver sub-phase, just as many chances for the attacker and defender to win, and the winner of this sub-phase can either choose to jink or choose to turn their opponent's model, and you can potentially turn your opponent's model all the way around like that if your agility is high enough. Say for example your Eldar. Then finally you shoot at each other. You have a look at this table to get to see who shoots first. And depending on the angle of attack, whether it's head-on, whether it's tailing, or whether it is other angles of attack, depends on what ballistic skill, whether you're snap firing or not. So at this angle of attack, this flyer gets to fire at that one at full ballistic skill, regardless of whether it is a fighter or not. At this angle of attack, this flyer gets to fire at that one at full ballistic skill if it is a fighter, and can only snap fire if it's a bomber or an attack fighter. And at this angle of attack, this one can only snap fire at that one, regardless of the model type. As for this one, he can only snap fire at that. At this angles, he can only snap fire at that, and at this angles, he can only snap fire at that. It's interesting to note that you cannot choose to jink during the attack sub-fight phase. If this one hits that one, it hits that one. You can only choose to jink if you won the maneuver sub-fight phase. The other thing to note is that it doesn't mention vehicle facings at any point. I'm assuming that's on purpose, and this is an assumption here. So if this one is snap firing at that one, it has a turret mounted weapon. I'm assuming only the turret mounting weapon can swing around and take snapshots at that, and the Skyhammer launchers cannot draw line of sight on this model. I'm assuming they intended that so that tail gunners on certain planes now come into effect. If you don't have, if you're at this angle and your weapons facing is this way, then this one can't fire at that one, but this one can fire at that one. I'm assuming that's what they mean. But I can certainly see this debate floating around the forums for a while until we see a FAQ. Anyway, that's the way we're going to play it here. Okay, that's my review done, so now I'm going to give you some thoughts, some impressions, and then bring this video to a close. So, first up, as for layout, the book looks lovely. I like all these pictures. I wasn't expecting as much fluff at the beginning of the book as we've got here, but it's a nice inclusion, and anytime Games Workshop decides to show me art like this, I like it. There aren't any Forge World datasheets in here. Are Forge World going to release a PDF, or are Forge World going to re-release Aeronauticus at the time of filming? I'm not sure. I suspect that we're going to get a whole other book from Forge World, which means I'm going to need this one, I'm going to need this one, and I'm going to need another book. As for the rules, I'm not overjoyed by the dogfight phase. I think it's a bit complex, and to be honest, I think we're probably going to ignore it, choose not to dogfight each other for most games, particularly if I'm going up against Eldar. I don't like the idea of my flyers being shot down before they hit the table. As for the rules themselves, there's some good and some bad. The idea that flyers can't take cover anymore, that's good. The idea that hovering flyers can come in hovering, that's good. The idea that only fighters can fire at full ballistic skill at each other, and minuses to ground targets. Yeah, that's good, but an attack flyer, something like this, only snap firing at a fighter, couldn't this just had a minus to its ballistic skill rather than just snap firing at flyers? It is what it is, that's what they've chosen to do, so that's what we'll follow. I quite like the idea of air superiority. If one player has 3 flyers and the other player doesn't have any flyers at all, surely the player with 3 flyers has got air superiority, but I can see this rule being interpreted in slightly different ways. It's a little bit fluffy about whether a dogfight does not or does take place. Is there always a dogfight phase? And it just so happens that there is no dogfights in that phase. In the same way that there's a psychic phase and 2 people haven't brought psychers, there's still essentially a psychic phase that you just skip, right? There's going to be some arguments there, but the notion that someone has got air superiority and therefore affects battlefield resolves is a good idea. Whether they've cracked that walnut, I'm not entirely convinced. I like the idea of attack wings and wing leaders. I'd like to see flyers making their way across the battlefield like something out of the Battle of Britain, dropping bombs. It's fluffy, it's nice, it's going to look good, but I can see attack wings being really tricky to pull off depending on the scenery on the table, depending on what models are on the table. Some of these attack patterns you're only ever going to be able to pull off when you first deploy your models on the table. Shooting away, and then they're going to break up all over the place. I can see why they brought the idea of agility into it, to do break turns halfway through, because once you're on the table in turn, say you're on the table in turn 2, and then these 3 fly off in 3 different directions, in order to form back into an attack wing, you're going to need to use that break wing rule, that break turn rule. Because it is going to be tough to reform into attack patterns like this. I wish they had a rule in it that said after they've broken up, if 2 models from, say, this wing manage to end up like that, then they can form that attack pattern. Or if 3 of these manage to end up like that, then they can form that attack pattern while one of them goes off. But it clearly doesn't state that. It says if a flyer wing ends its movement phase in one of the attack patterns listed. So the whole wing needs to remain in formation or not. They could have played around with that a little bit more. That would have been, then you might see more wings, more attack patterns. I think another missed opportunity was changing the points cost of some of these flyers. The Crimson Hunter, for example, we could have added 500 points onto that, couldn't we? Particularly when it's got a really high pursuit and agility value. And particularly when we look at the poor Dark Angel, 160 points, 170 points, they could have brought these down or put the Crimson Hunter up. There's, particularly as they're saying that these datasheets overrule the ones in the main codex, there could have been some tweaks. I like the new Stormhawk Interceptor. I think it's pretty. I bought 2 of them. And these kits now make Storm Talon gunships. I guess they chucked another sprue in there. And I'm sorely tempted to build 4 of these rather than 2 of these. And because these are going to be hitting the ground on 2s, these are now hitting the ground on 4s. What you get if you make one of these, well, you get to re-roll your Jinx saves. You get more DACA. But 125 points on a 2 hull point model. Yeah. But they do look pretty, and if I build 2 of them, I can form this strike wing formation, so I guess I'm going to go with 2 Stormhawks. Final thoughts? Well, I remember when 7th edition came only 2 years after 6th edition, it felt like it was a bit too early. Typically they allow 4 years to run before they release another edition, and by about that time you're calling out for an edition. Things are beginning to get a bit stale and you want a new book. But 7th edition came around a bit too quickly, and this has come out 2 years after 7th edition. And I felt the same sort of way. I didn't want to buy this book. I didn't feel the game needed this book. But it's here now, and we're going to have to love it or leave it. We're going to have to use it if we want to play with lots of different people from lots of different parts of the country. If you're in a group and there's only 2 or 3 of you, you can choose to ignore it if you want to, but I guarantee that some version of these rules will end up in 8th edition when 8th edition actually drops. It's not really, this isn't really Warhammer 40k 8th edition, it's Warhammer 7.1 edition, 7.0 edition. It's here now, we've got it, we're going to be using it. Anyway, I'm conscious of the time and conscious that I'm beginning to ramble, so I'll bring it to a close here. Thank you very much for watching and happy wargaming.